Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the first video in our Patrick Adair Supplies subscription box. Today we're going to be starting with the basics, and the whole idea of this is it's going to be something that is a fun project for you to do at home, and you can end up having some really cool rings. And then we're also going to try to go over just as many different techniques and steps that you can to kind of give you guys all of the learning and just experience that you need to be good ring makers. So we're going to start with a ring today that is a ring that we usually have any of our new employees start out with. It's the blackout ring, and it's one it's pretty hard to mess up because the ring is so dark that any imperfections are hidden really well. So I'm here with Dave. He is the head of our glowstone department. He's made more glowstone rings than I ever have, and he's also our quality control guy. And so he knows a lot of different just tips and tricks and things similar to me that he'll be able to help you just go along in the video and just figure out how to do it. And we should be left with some pretty good results. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so when you first get your box, it'll come looking a little something like this. And inside is going to be everything you need to complete the individual ring. And so we've got the ring blank here, the Meteorite that we're going to use for it because this month's ring is the blackout ring. And then we've got our pigment. It's going to be black pigment for this ring. And then green glow powder. So this glows green. This is, between the both of these, more than enough for several rings, but we just kind of want to put a little extra in there. And then an extra vial, and this is just to mix things in. And so other than that, obviously you're going to need a ring mandrel set. So we've got that here. And then you're just gonna need, obviously, safety equipment. So we've got dust mask, face shield, gloves. These can be nice if you don't want to get super glue on your fingers, but you do want to be careful about what gloves you wear around a lathe. These are nitrile. They're designed to rip, not stretch and wrap around the lathe. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's go ahead and I'm going to pull the lathe out and we'll talk a little bit about that. So we've got the lathe out, and if you didn't know, we buy our lathes from Harbor Freight. These are just they're about $550, I think, for their metal machining lathes. And if you don't have one, there are some cheaper alternatives. You can get a woodworking lathe, and as long as it has an adjustable jaw like this and it will fit a 1/2 inch mandrel, you should be good for using that. And that it'd be a lot harder to do any of the more complex rings that require machining, but for glowstone rings like this one we're doing today, it'll be perfectly fine. So if you're interested, I'll probably do a video that goes into a little bit more depth about your options for a lathe, but for now, just know that you're definitely gonna be good with one of these, and you could also go a little bit cheaper. And so for starting off, you're going to get, obviously, a ring in the size that you select. And this ring is tungsten. So this is a material that's fairly easy to work with and pretty robust. And so we thought this would be an excellent choice for, multiple reasons why we're doing this ring first, but that's just another one. And we need to find the mandrel that it fits best on. And so my advice is to always use the largest mandrel you can, as close or as long as you can get the ring blank itself as close as you can to the end of it. That's usually when you have better results. So just a little tip for you. All right, so I've got the lathe all ready to go. I'm going to use my chuck key to expand it. That way the mandrel can fit in, obviously. And then it's just super simple. Tighten it on there. It's in place. And one thing to take into consideration is you always want to be wary of safety, obviously. And so if this ring was bigger, if it was on one of these back rows, your fingers would have to get awfully close to the teeth on the jaws of the lathe. And that's obviously a safety concern. So what I would do in that situation is I would bring the mandrel out just maybe like a 1/2 inch. And that just gives you a little bit room for safety. If your ring is all the way out on this end here, obviously you can put it all the way in and you've still got 2 or 3 inches between you and the lathe. So just depending on the step that it fits on is how I would recommend fitting the mandrel in there. So I'm gonna give it just probably like a little bit of a centimeter of space. And now the mandrels come with their own Allen key. But I'm just gonna be using this one. You want to make sure it's on there straight, so there's several ways of testing that. But you just tighten it until there's tension in the screw. That means it's hitting against the ring blank. But you can see that just spun loose, so that wasn't very tight. You always want to be just kind of as gentle as you can. You want to use as much pressure as you need to get it to hold in place, but no more than that if you can. So now I'm gonna test and see. That's spinning super straight. Show you on the secondary camera angle here just how you can tell that it's spinning straight. And I'm gonna take this off and try to show you guys what it would look like if it wasn't, just so you can know what to look out for. So I just purposely put that on a little bit sideways. You can see that wobbling. And you can still make a ring like that. Because this is tungsten, you're not really gonna mess up the bevels if it's a little bit sideways. But just always do it the best you can. And that's just another reason why this is a good ring to start on, just because, like I said, there's not a lot to mess up. So that, you can see it's perfectly straight. So we've got the ring on there, it's mounted, it's on there securely. I tightened it down, not too tight, obviously. And then now we are ready to get our materials ready. All right, so now I'm gonna have Dave show you how he selects his meteorite fragments. So we've got this paper towel here, we're just gonna kind of spread it all out here. In here, there are shavings, as well as this bigger piece that you can pull other chunks off of, and then just some chunks that we have pre-cut for you. And so Dave has a rule of thumb that he usually does for the rings. I'll let him explain that.
So usually you want to take the ring size and then add 2, and that will be the number of inlay pieces you should use. This one's a 9.5, so I'll use 11 to 12.
Okay, yeah, so basically, depending on the ring size, obviously there's going to be more of a diameter that you need to fill, and so you need more pieces the bigger the size goes, so that's the reason for that, just kind of rule of thumb. We're grabbing all these pieces. Is that 12?
Well,
or did you count them?
We're gonna count them up.
Okay. Okay.
They're huge.
Yeah, some of these are bigger than we want, and so we're just setting these aside. And then to cut them up further, it's good to have just a sturdy pair of wire cutters and just pliers in general. You can even get bolt cutters to do some of the bigger pieces. But like this fragment here, it's got a little thin section on here. So you can just grab that, snap it off, and we've got another piece. So between Dave and I, we're just going to work on processing this material until we get the pieces the size that we want. All right, so I've just got a metal 1, 2, 3 block here. I'm putting down my piece here. And obviously, you know, there's 1,000 different ways to process meteorite and get it into chunks. So this is just one that, just another method that I like. So I'm just gonna hit it with the blowtorch. One thing here, I'll stop this real quick. You don't want it to make a very good contact with the metal block itself because it's going to dissipate all of the heat into it. So one thing I like to do is I like to grab some meteorite shavings, and that just holds it up off of the metal. That way we're not losing all of our heat to the metal block. And I'm gonna add another block underneath it so I don't start melting the mat. That's kind of jumping the gun a little bit. If you don't have one of these blocks, you can do it on the concrete. That's not super scientific, but just pick up some of these blocks. They're like 12 bucks on Amazon, I'm pretty sure. They're just called 1, 2, 3 blocks. So I'm just going to hit this with the blowtorch until it starts glowing a little bit red. And then I'll just flatten it with the hammer. Okay, so we've got that glowing hot. That's not as hot as I usually like to get it, but this still demonstrates the point. Then I just cool it off with a bit of water. Definitely don't want to burn yourself. Be very wary of safety whenever you're doing anything in the shop, really. And you can see that is flattened quite a bit, and that was just with one round of heating it. And it is pretty much just ready to process. That is about as thin as I like to get it. If you get it too thin, it's just kind of look like shavings in your ring. So it is possible to do it too thin. So be careful of that. You can see here's those two pieces that we got just super quickly. We can even cut them down to be a little bit smaller. But that is just another method you can use for processing down the meteorite, making it a lot more manageable. So we should be able to get a ton of different chunks off just that one piece. All right, so we've got all of the steps covered for the meteorite. You can see we've got some excess for another project, and then we still have that big chunk that we can always cut more pieces off. So we've got our small pieces that we've cut here. These are small enough to go in for a ring. And then I'll set these aside. These are still a little bit too big that they need to be cut down. And then our shavings over here, these are really important. They really help accent the ring. So I really like putting in just a healthy amount of shavings into a lot of the rings. And it's really subtle. It gives it just kind of a little shine. And I think it really adds to the organic look of the rings that I personally really strive for. I think it looks best if, and that's why I call it glowstone. I want it to be an organic looking material. So stone, obviously that's natural. And so there's a little bit of strategy involved in how you inlay the pieces of meteorite. And then the meteorite shavings, they just help to further that natural look. So now let's switch over and we need to mix together our pigments, or our pigment with our glow powder. Once we're done with that, we will be completely ready to start inlaying the ring. So in this vial here, this is just a vial full of black pigment, and then this is just pure green glow powder. So I've got the mixing vial here. I'm going to put in here just enough to make a ring. It'll be a little bit extra, but if you want to know how much you need to do in case you're trying to conserve as much as you can, I'm gonna go a little bit on the safe side. I'll put about that much in there. So you can see that's probably about 1/3 to 1/4 of a vial. And then we need to add our black pigment. And black pigment especially is very strong. You can very easily add too much. And because this is a black ring, you kind of can't add too much, but that's kind of what you would think naturally. But if you add more black pigment, it's going to really detract from the glow. So there is kind of a bit of strategy that you want to use to make sure that you're not adding too much, or you're really going to just kind of cripple the overall glow that the ring has. And so I'm not going to take this vial and pour it directly in. That has a risk of having a piece so big that I ruin it, I add too much. So what I'm gonna do, I've just got this plastic baggie here. I'll pour a little bit on here. I kind of got some clumps there. I'm just gonna pour some more out. I'm using our old stock of black pigment, so if you get pigment, it won't be clumpy like this. We use a new pigment that's a mica powder. So if you're curious why I'm doing that and you don't see it in your pigment, it's because we've since upgraded it. So I've got it laid out here. I've got a bunch of the pigment. I'm just going to use my tweezers and just pick up a good amount of it, put it in there, screw the cap back on, and I'm going to very thoroughly shake this. If you don't shake it all the way and it looks like it's not dark enough and you add more and then you shake it enough the next time, you're going to be left with too much pigment in there. So definitely not a good thing. And that looks like that'll probably be enough for this ring. You can do a more of a charcoal color if you want your ring to glow better. And so, especially when you're making the ring, you know, you can do it however you want. You can even choose to leave the pigment out if you want. But I think it is a good skill to learn. So, there's still a little bit stuck to the bottom. I'm just gonna make sure I've got it completely shaken how I want. Okay, that is very thoroughly shaken. And I'm trying to show a color on camera that's as accurate as possible. So I've made sure I've got my exposure set how I want it on the camera, so this will be as accurate as possible for you guys watching. But obviously every screen's a little bit different, so you got to take this with a little grain of salt, and you might have to do some experimenting on your own. This is a fairly dark charcoal color, and I want to do a color sample. I'm I've personally mixed a lot, and I think this is going to be a little bit too light, but if you're experimenting at home, a really easy way is to just do a test, because the color actually will get quite a bit darker once you mix in your super glue. So I'm going to take that same 1, 2, 3 block I was using earlier. These are really handy, like I said. And then I'm just putting down just a dab of super glue. And then I'm going to sprinkle some of our powder onto it. You want to make sure it absorbs the glue so that it actually darkens. And I'll show you what I mean here. You can see we've got just the pure pigment here, or the pigment mixed with the glow powder that is dry, and it blows away when I blow it. But this is not. This is completely wet with the super glue. We can see it's a fairly dark color, almost a black, but just not quite as dark as I want it. So I'm going to go back and add a little bit more. Let me make sure. I think that'll be dark enough, actually. So I'll show you on camera again. That's a little overexposed. So that's more realistic how it is now. I just set the exposure to match kind of how it looks like to my perspective right now. All right, so I'm gonna have Dave go ahead and start working on the ring. Just to note, we've got medium viscosity super glue. That's what we use for the majority of things on our ring. And then right here, we've got some thin super glue. We will share with you when we're switching between the two, but just if you're curious, probably about 90% of the time, we'll be using medium. And if you don't wanna get thin viscosity, you can get away perfectly fine just with medium only. So I'll hand it over to Dave now.
All right. So first I'm gonna start picking out some pieces that I like. You want them to be a wide array of sizes just to keep that natural look. If you choose some that are too similar, it's going to look very uniform at the end. So you want to get small pieces as well as larger pieces. Then we can go ahead and just start putting those in there. So you want to apply a small amount of glue, just enough to hold one of the pieces in there. And then you can just go ahead and drop it on in. It's also important to make sure that your pieces will show. So a good way to do that is just like look at the ring eye level. And if it's above the sides, then it's going to show on the final product.
Yeah. And one thing to note as well, all of the pieces you want to, while you're inlaying them, you want to keep in mind the fact that you don't want them to fall out. And so I think the easiest way to demonstrate that, it would be, I'll just draw it on a sticky note actually. So, if you've got the groove of your ring like this, so here's a side profile of the ring, you want to put pieces in, if all the pieces were a perfect triangle, it'd be super easy, but no pieces are perfect, all of them are a little bit different, but basically try to have the widest part of the ring, the widest part of the inlay material at the bottom of it, that way we can build up our powder around it, and it's wedged in place. The opposite of this, the incorrect way to do it would be like this, and that's when you're going to run into problems while you're sanding or just while you're wearing the ring. The piece of it can just slip right out. So, don't want to do that. Inlay your pieces like that. That'll give you the strongest, most secure fit into the ring.
And once you've got your pieces set in there, you can take a little bit of your glow powder and pour it over top just to kind of hold those pieces in while you put the rest of them in. After you get your first piece in, you're gonna want to find, I don't know, something probably a little smaller, just to get a good mix of them, and just use the same technique as the first one. Just put it in, make sure it's gonna show, then put glow powder over it. As far as spacing goes, what I like to do is not really think about where I'm putting them and then just keep going. That'll help preserve the natural look.
Yeah, the issue is kind of naturally, people tend to space the inlay materials on your rings out very uniformly. And it's kind of funny, like you'll make a ring, and if you're not aware of this issue, you'll make it and you'll finish it, and the pieces, if you get out like a ruler, you'll measure the space in between and it'll be super uniform. And so it is kind of tricky. You got to think about making sure that it looks random, which is kind of hard. So you want to group some pieces together. You want to have big pieces next to small pieces. You don't want it to be super uniform or to have much of a pattern to it. And of course you can if you want to. It's your ring. You can do whatever you want. But these are the directions that we use in order to get the brand specific rings that we do, obviously. So how many of the pieces have you inlaid so far, Dave?
It looks
Is that
like
most of them?
9. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just gonna kind of fill
So
in
he's
the
gone all the
gaps.
way around the ring once, and now's the time to, and he's still got, I'm counting over on the side here, he's still got about 4 pieces left. So we started with 12, so we've put the majority of them in, and now he's just gonna go back and kind of think through and see where he thinks more pieces are needed. The entire thing with you, but just know that I just inspected the ring. I made sure the spacing was, quite random, and we're gonna have a lot of variation to this. And so now, are you gonna do the shavings now?
Add a layer
You
of
do a
glow
layer.
powder first.
Okay, so yeah, the reason for adding the layer first before we do the shavings is because if we add them now, the shavings are small enough that it'll just kind of disappear underneath the surface of it.
Okay. So you just want to add a very thin layer of glue across the entire ring, even where you've already done it.
Yeah.
And then
And you'll notice we haven't used any super glue accelerator up until this point, and so there's no worry of there being any residual accelerator that's going to harden it. So if you're making the ring and you already used some accelerator to fix it into place, you might want to grab a heat gun and make sure that's perfectly evaporated, because if you put a thin layer down along your whole ring and you've got even just a little bit of accelerator, you'll find that it's probably going to be hardened by the time you even go to add the glow powder.
So once you've got your thin layer down, you still want to make sure that there is no part of the ring blade showing. You just cover it all in glow powder.
And when you say that, you mean the surface of the groove down underneath. So obviously you can see the metal reflecting if there was a gap where there wasn't any material. So that's what he's saying. We don't want there to be any clear sections in the ring where you can see all the way down to the center where the tungsten is.
Then I'm gonna go ahead and spray a little accelerator just to make sure everything's locked in place. You really don't need too much of that, depending on what kind you have. I don't know.
Yeah, so yeah, that's good. He literally just turned the lathe on, did 2 teeny little sprays with the accelerator. That's just locking everything in place, making sure we don't have it sagging or going anywhere we don't want it. And so now here's a step. If you're making the ring along with us, you want to make sure that the small layer that you did doesn't raise above the surface of the edges of the ring, because we still need our shavings to show up. So just do a check, make sure that layer was thin enough.
Yes. So like I said, just put down a nice thin layer of glue, and you're gonna add the most shavings where the biggest gaps in your ring are, between the inlay. So just kind of sprinkle them in there until you think they're good. Then we'll put a little glow powder on top of those.
Okay.
Just to kind of fill in the cracks.
Yeah, and it's important to, and I think just going back, Dave didn't add super glue around the entire circumference of the ring, and that's so we can focus on these little sections. And an important reason for that is he put those shavings in, and he needs to add that glow powder while the super glue is still wet. And so we wouldn't want to spend a lot of time putting the shavings in and have it harden on us. That's not the biggest issue in the world, but it will leave us with kind of a clear layer at the top, and the shavings will look just kind of a little bit weird. So smaller sections for this step, because we're getting to the point where the things that we are doing are going to show on the surface of the ring.
It's also important to make sure that you don't clump up shavings, because in the final product it'll look a little too uniform and kind of weird sometimes. We're gonna do a little more accelerator and some heat gun, just to lock everything in place.
So yeah, and if you've never used accelerator before for super glue, it's super effective. You hardly need any of it. But if you get too much, you can always just get rid of it with the heat gun, or just wait for it to evaporate. From here, all we're going to be doing is the glow powder. And so at this point, it's going to be tricky to see on camera, but the entire ring is not going to be flush with the edges of the tungsten on here. So we just need to build that up a little bit more. And then we can get into the steps where we'll start grinding it down. And you're doing this spot by spot, right? So
just kind of,
you could just go around, and right now it's not super bulky, but if you just go and keep adding glue and powder everywhere all over the ring until you've got it built up enough, you're gonna be left with a lot of sanding to do. So this is where you might wanna be a little bit more careful with that. Obviously, there's really no mistaking with too much. It's just gonna take you a little more time to sand it down.
so then we're gonna go ahead and do one final thing of accelerator.
Okay. And you just added glue without adding powder to that. And I know I did it, but can you just explain
It'll darken up any excess powder, and then it's just, some of it's going to get sanded off anyways, so it kind of wastes glow powder.
Yeah. And one thing that I think is good for that is if there were a few pockets on the ring that were just a little bit below the surface that the ring will be once we grind it down, and that's going to leave a little bit of just a clearness to it. So we've got the ring completely inlaid. From here on out, we're just going to be grinding it down and then polishing it. And so I wanted to mention some important safety tips that are especially relevant for these steps. You're always going to be wanting to wear a face shield or at least a pair of goggles, safety glasses. And then, especially for super glue fumes, having a dust mask that covers your nose and mouth is very helpful. In this ring, we're not using any toxic or dangerous materials, but the vapors from the super glue, those are always prevalent, that's the word, yeah, prevalent. And then just you don't want to get hit with debris from meteorite pieces. And then a big thing to know, especially if you're new into ring making, if you didn't fully cure the super glue throughout your process, you might have it hardened on the outside, but there might be a wet pocket of super glue on the inside. And what sucks is if you're grinding into that with a Dremel, it will whip around super fast and it can spray wet super glue all over. And so especially if you're starting out, always be sure to wear a face shield. That way you don't have to worry about anything, including super glue, spraying around like that. So we're gonna go ahead and get started on the grinding down. We like to just keep it simple and go with a Dremel, and that's what we're going to do in this video. But if you're working with especially like harder materials, if we were doing like ruby or something, that's when you work with some more specialty equipment. Maybe you'd get out a diamond wheel for that, or go over to a belt sander and do some of that. But we're gonna keep it simple for now. We'll get into a little bit more technique maybe in another video, but especially for this ring where it is a fairly easy to work with material. All of these materials are fairly easy to work with. We're just gonna keep it simple with the Dremel. So for the actual grinding down of it, we are using, this is called a, I think a flex shaft rotary tool, but you can use just a Dremel. That's what we use mainly in the shop. I like this here at my video workstation because it's a little bit more versatile of a tool, but especially for the glow rings, all you're gonna need is a Dremel, so don't worry about spending any extra for one of these. And they work the exact same way. So we've just got, this is actually a Dremel brand quick change adapter. So it's actually really handy. If you don't have one of these, I think Home Depot carries them. And that's all it takes to switch mandrels out. And then you're gonna wanna keep several coarse sanding drums ready because you're gonna go through these pretty quickly. You can use them for a long time, but if you use them for too long, it's going to damage the ring and make it look worse. And it's just gonna be wasting more of your time. So they're gonna be more effective and things are gonna go a lot faster if you are changing these out fairly regularly.
All right, so once your ring is fully inlaid, you'll notice that it's not going to be even all the way around. So the first step in sanding is you're going to find the high points and you're just going to tap your Dremel on them very lightly, just so they're a little more level. Then after that, you can go ahead and just sand everything across.
All right, so the water that he's putting on there, that is to keep everything cool. Super glue, if you overheat it too much, it loses its like glue properties, so it's gonna like fall apart, and it's also going to look worse. And so it's only if you got it extremely hot, and so it's not as kind of important as I'm making it sound here, but it is something you wanna be aware of. You don't want your material to overheat, and so just keep it cool. You can use water, or you can just be a lot more gentle with how you sand it. All right, so two checks that we want to do at this point. We want to make sure that there's not any major holes or voids in the ring. And because we did a good job inlaying it, we have nothing we really need to worry about here. If you do have a hole in it, you can obviously put down just a little tiny bit of super glue and then fill it in with the glow powder. So very simple, then you just repeat the steps, sand it down till it's flush. And now we've got the ring how it is now, or you'll have the ring the way that we have this one now. And then a final thing to check, and this is really easy on tungsten rings, is you don't want any super glue on the edges of it. That'll just look bad and it'll flake off over time. You only want super glue on the inlay where it's meant, not on the metal. So an easy way to do that is to grab something like a razor blade, turn the lathe on, and you can just rub it against it. You want to be careful here, you don't want to cut yourself. And you just put the blade against the metal, and it's not making any noise, and I can't feel it hitting any bumps. So I know that this section of the metal It's perfectly free of any super glue. Like here, I heard it bump like for a couple of revolutions, but then the piece got knocked off really quickly. So I'm making sure the bevels are good. Nothing on here. There's a little bit on this edge. And it just takes a minute. And it's feeling really smooth now. But I'll do a visual check. And yeah, that looks really good. And so now we will begin the sanding steps. I'll hand it back over to Dave here in a sec. But basically, we've just got all of our sandpaper here. You want to have a good selection of sandpaper. We like to start at a 220 grit. You can go a little bit lower to start off with. You can do even as low as like 100 and you're not going to have any problems. But you can do 100, and especially if you're just getting started, I might even recommend going to some lower grits that are a lot more rough. And just to make sure you do a thorough job of getting rid of any of the scratch marks left by the very rough, I think it's about 40 or 60 grit that the rough Dremel sandpaper leaves. And so that's just my 2 cents for this step. Just make sure that you're very thorough with your first steps of the sandpaper. Then from then on out, it's a lot more just kind of relaxed.
So you want to make sure you do a lot of water during hand sanding, and then pay attention to where you're putting your hands. So generally you want it on the back, on the bottom of the ring.
Yeah, and just the sandpaper is a lot more effective if you keep it wet. It doesn't get full of the gunk and just lasts a lot longer. So that's one of the major reasons why we like to wet sand.
So you want to spend a good 20 to 30 seconds on each grit of sandpaper just to make sure that you use all of it up and got the ring to where you want it to be.
All right, so that is the sanding finished on the ring. We did a really good, thorough job here, and we are ready for the polishing steps. All right, now polishing, it's really easy. If you know how to use a buffing wheel, you should know how to do the polishing. So on the left, we've got our, this is what I've got the medium polish on, and then on the right, we've got our finer polish. So the green, that will give us a mirror finish. The white, that's really good at getting rid of any of the scratch marks or anything like that. So, turn this on. You just apply a little bit of polish. I'll do it to both wheels. And then you still want to be careful not to melt any of the ring. As long as you're just doing what I'm doing here, you won't have any issues. If you hold it to there too long, that's when you can run into those problems. So I recommend just rotate it slightly, kind of just tap it on the wheel, and continue. So, I went around at least 2 or 3 times. That should be really good. There were not any major imperfections I was worried about on this ring, and so if there were, I would want to double check and make sure we got it, but because it was a pretty good consistent finish to begin with, I know that step should have been good. So, now I'm going over to the final polish over here. So that's the ring. Obviously we still need to show off the glow in the dark ability, so I'm gonna go take a few pictures of it. We'll show it in both dark and light environments, just to give you guys an idea of it. But I hope you guys really enjoyed that tutorial. If you have any questions, always feel free to hit us up using our support email. But hopefully that gives you guys a really good idea on how to craft these rings and get good results. So thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next month with the next ring.